Well, hello there, how is everyone? I hope you're all well on this Monday morning. That's right, it's Monday already. Where is time going? It's going to be Christmas soon. Anyway, so we get straight into the meat and potatoes. Because even though, look, I know you're looking fantastic, I appreciate that time is of the essence and we need to get moving quickly. And I'm also conscious that this introduction is dragging out longer than it perhaps should. But look, Brian Kohberger, the Idaho 4 case, is getting to a point now where, look, we're about to sort of venture into a period of non-activity, I believe. I know we've got some hearings coming up, but ultimately there isn't going to likely be anything new and mind-blowing come out for a while, I imagine. Look, we might get a curveball, who knows, but until then, I think it's fair that what we do is we look at other cases, we look at other things that need to be spoken about, and that's what we're going to do. But I think that what we do also need to do at this point is just sort of touch on one last question before we move forward and await something to happen. And that is the why. Why did Brian Kohberger, if he's the guy who did this? Because look, ultimately we only have at this stage one person in custody. We only have one person who's being blamed. So we only have one reference point with regards to why did this person who they're saying did this crime do it, if in fact he did. And we have to address that. And some people will turn around and say, that's not important. They don't need the why to convict. They just need the proof and the evidence to support the fact that that is in fact who did it. And, you know, that has to be done beyond a reasonable doubt. And the normality is that there is usually means, motive and opportunity spoken about. Which, does someone have the means? Do they have the motive? And do they have the opportunity? And it's when they come into this motive situation that focuses primarily on the reasons behind it. Now, in the Idaho 4 case, this area has been particularly difficult. And some people think there's a slam dunk, and some people will turn around and say, well, we know why this was done. This was someone who did a crime who was fixated on someone. There was someone who was targeted, and there has been things been said that supports this being a targeted crime. We heard right at the very beginning with law enforcement coming out in their press conferences and saying or alluding to the fact that this was targeted. Then they'd turn around and say, we don't think it's targeted. Then they were saying that they didn't know whether the house was targeted or the people within the house was targeted. And something that always sort of resonated as a little bit strange to me was the fact that they sort of claimed that the house itself could have been targeted. It was almost like saying that the house in its entirety, something about that house meant that you could potentially have seen something happen to the house, and the people within that house were merely collateral damage. And I found that interesting because, as some of you guys who have been interested in not just sticking your head in the sand and running with the Brian Kohberger did this, he's guilty, there's nothing else we need to look at, and anything else that's looked at outside of that is just conspiracy or rabbit holes, etc., etc. The house itself does have a history. There has a history where certain people involved in the ownership of said house have been involved in potentially nefarious stuff, including cameras being placed within the property, so on and so forth. And look, do we know whether these stories are 100% accurate? No, we don't. But when law enforcement are kind of coming across and saying, or confusing the situation as to whether they felt that a person or the property was being sort of targeted, it's odd. Do you know what I mean? It's a bit odd. Anyway, I digress. So with respect of the why, we've also heard the likes of Steve Gonsalves coming forward. Now, Steve Gonsalves, God bless him, you know, he's obviously lost a child and he's an incredibly angry man, but he has held it together, I would say, better than what I would hold it together. But he hasn't done any favours to the the thought process from anybody who has invested their time in thinking about what could and couldn't have happened, because he himself and the Gonsalves family as a whole have changed certain things that they have said along the way. They have, or Steve especially, has made statements that would make you think, okay, so, and I'll, case in point being when he said they didn't have to venture upstairs, which to me, you can take that in numerous different ways, but it would almost be like when you pair that with, was this a target attack and they didn't have to go upstairs, was Steve alluding to the fact that perhaps Xana or Ethan were a target, and if they were killed first, then there wasn't really any reason to take that attack any further because what the perpetrator came in to do had been done. You could take it other ways, but that is how I interpreted what he said there. And then when you pair that with other things that have been said regarding the injuries and certain people sustaining more injuries or different injuries, and some of the information that I've heard on the back end, and look, I don't know whether this information that you receive is accurate, is it honest, who knows, but we as content creators do get an abundance of stuff, and some of it does hold some credibility and some don't. But anyway, with regards to Brian Kohberger, and when we try and think about the motive to it, and let's not forget, again, when we look at Steve Gonsalves, when he's gone through these motions and emotions, he sort of, the latest thing that he said was that with regards to Brian Kohberger, this was almost like a crime of passion. This was a crime of passion. So when we look at Brian Kohberger and we contemplate this being a crime of passion, I don't know about you guys, but I don't get that vibe. And there are certain things that I feel for this to be a crime of passion are missing. Specifically, when we listen to Ann Taylor and what Ann Taylor is potentially insinuating, that there is a lack of information on her client that provides a link between him and the victims. Now, if this was a crime of passion, now what do you kind of conclude when you think of a crime of passion? Now, a crime of passion to me is someone who is in a relationship with someone, that relationship goes awry, and they take out revenge. It could be something else, like the Chad Doberman situation, where he exacted some form of revenge on his partner, on the children. And again, we've heard that this guy had violent tendencies in the past as well. So you've got someone who has proclivities towards violence, and then exacerbated by issues in a relationship, and that leads to what it did with Chad Doberman and his children, his boys. So crimes of passion, for me, there has to be a link between the person who does the crime and the victim of the crime. Now, could there be something beyond that? And yes, there could. There can be situations where someone becomes fixated on someone, they could become obsessed with somebody via a different channel. So with regards to Brian Kohberger and one of these victims, how would that look? What would that look like? And the only things that come to mind would be, again, social media. Is there a social media element to this? Did he just find Maddie, for instance, on social media, become fixated with her, and then this turned into this crime of passion? But then I think to myself, there's things missing within that, because there are other stories that have come out where Brian Kohberger has approached other females. He has tried to reach out to them to the point where they have become uncomfortable. Their friends have stepped in. Again, we don't know how true it is, but if there is any truth to it, then what that tells me is that if Brian Kohberger had become fixated, or he wanted to date somebody, then he would have at least attempted to approach them, possibly approach them to the point of annoyance, which then would have led you to believe that people around these victims would have at least heard of Brian Kohberger. There would be someone who would be able to say, oh yeah, we know of Brian because he was the one who was constantly messaging Maddie on Snapchat or Instagram. But there doesn't seem to be, if you believe what Ann Taylor is saying, there doesn't seem to be any link between them in that fashion. So if you move that out of the equation, what does that leave you with? And all that then leaves you with is a potential that maybe they met at the Mad Greek restaurant. But then the Mad Greek restaurant severed that link because they said that Brian Kohberger had nothing to do with the Mad Greek restaurant. You know, they almost knocked that in the bud. And you think, if there was an issue that stemmed from interaction between Brian and the victim at that facility, then there would be something there. There would be something tangible to be able to say, yeah, well, this is obviously where this stemmed from. So I find it incredibly difficult to say that this was a crime of passion, because for that to be a crime of passion, there has to be a relationship of some degree between perpetrator and victim. And I can't for the life of me see how that transpired in amongst all this when nobody knows anything. And again, if you take into consideration the aforementioned, what Ann Taylor is alluding to, the fact that there doesn't seem to be any link whatsoever, I just feel there's something missing to conclude that. And I know the likes of Ken Mains, that is kind of their go-to, and I feel that this is why you find so many cases that law enforcement deal with in terms of homicides, that the conviction rate is so low. There is a confirmation bias. There is this go-to that they feel that if a female victim and a male perpetrator, then it must be love. There must be some obsession involved. Or we hear the incel theory coming up. And again, the only time that the incel theory has been pushed with regards to Brian Kohberger, there seems to be a lack of evidence to support. And almost like, as much as there's people saying this, there are other people coming out and saying completely the opposite. And we've even seen, again, which I've spoken about, the interactions between Brian and females that doesn't support that narrative whatsoever. In fact, it goes completely the opposite when you take into consideration things like his appearance at The Handmaid's Tale, his interaction with the female police officer, and even the fact of his interaction with Ann Taylor as a female defence attorney. Look, I'm just saying that as it is. I can't see someone who was what people are trying to push Brian Kohberger as having the same interactions as what we've seen. And again, like the female who apparently reached out to Brian Kohberger for assistance when she felt that she was in danger, and it makes you wonder, why did she feel safe enough to go to Brian, of all people, to have a discussion about being helped and assisted to make her property secure and for her to feel safe? But again, some people tried to twist that into something else, but it is what it is. A female goes to Brian for assistance and help, and there has been nothing brought forward. There's been no separate grand jury. There's been no separate case that's been raised in the background. He's not, as far as we know, facing any other charges regarding anything else. So in terms of things that have been supported and they have been proven, you've got nothing that supports an incel theory. So look, what does that leave you with? Again, if we're thinking about why Brian Kohberger did this crime, and for me, it leaves only two real options. And that is that Brian Kohberger was an academic. He was obsessed with his field. He was obsessed with learning about the minds of criminals, how they operated, how they felt while they did crimes and afterwards. And it makes you wonder whether this entire situation was a situation that Brian Kohberger wanted to find himself in. It was something that he placed himself in purposefully. And he felt that he could fight the system and beat the system. The flip side of the coin is that there is a narcotics element to it. Now, I know we're currently seeing a recycling of the information over the tunnels. We've touched on it on this channel, the tunnels, with regards to the heating of these colleges, so on and so forth. They're in abundance across the entire US. I don't feel that this was some kind of Mission Impossible movie-style killing. I don't believe that people were tunneling about under the roads and getting into 1122 King Road. I don't. I believe this is something much more simple, and that is that this is indeed a narcotics-related situation, or it was an academic in Brian who was completely obsessed with what he was learning and wanted to put that into practice. Now, whether he came unstuck and made a mistake, made an error, who knows, or perhaps every single element of this case is exactly as it needed to be. Who knows? And perhaps later on down the line, we will learn more. And like I say, this video isn't about saying that I think Brian Kohberger did the crime or I don't think he did the crime. This is specifically about trying to understand if Brian Kohberger is indeed the person who did it and we have the right perpetrator, which, to be fair, guys, I will say this, I would prefer that, because the alternative is a lot more scary. Because the alternative is there is a killer out there still. There is a killer out there still. And they're watching in the wings, waiting for something to happen that potentially gives them an opportunity to do this again. And let's make no bones about it. Look at what happened. Look at the killing itself. Would we really want that to happen again? And I don't think anybody would. No creator, no person watching any of these videos, nobody would want this crime to happen again. So I personally hope that the person who did it is behind bars. I've just not seen enough to 100% convince me that there isn't more to it. And that's why, for me, the narcotics situation, the narcotics element of it, is something that has resonated strong with me. And I'm not saying that these kids were drug dealers or they're involved in the cartel or anything like that. But look, there is evidence to say that on the peripheral of their lives, there was the narcotics industry sort of chomping at the bit in the background. And all it takes is for one of those people to have been a target because of something someone else did. They went in there to scare someone, to threaten someone, and that escalated into something way, way beyond. Broke into something that it never meant to be. And what sort of gives you hints that that was it? The fact that there was no guns used, it was a knife crime. Was this just about scaring someone, and did they feel that going into this property with a knife was a much more valid way to scare somebody? Who knows? I don't know. I'm spitballing. But narcotics is rife in this area. They do have a problem. It's something that they don't seem to have got a grip on. It's getting worse as time progresses. Yes, they've had a massive result recently with the fentanyl, or the fake fentanyl bust that was nearly $1 million, but they have an issue. They have a strong issue. And when you consider the percentage of the residents of this area, predominantly students, then what we're saying is that this issue is rife amongst the student community. And you can't ignore it. For those of you who have been around this channel for a while, we've touched on it in the past, especially around Washington, also, where they were utilising, law enforcement were utilising people who were involved in this as moles, if you like, and making busts on. There were female students who were running quite successful narcotics, how can I say, businesses, small businesses that were running into the $250,000 a year. And it happens. Is that what was happening here? Who knows? But again, there are little things that would suggest that there's a possibility of that. And I'm not saying that that is 100% what's happening, please, I don't think. And whatever happened to these students, there is nothing that justifies it. But at the end of the day, it did happen for a reason. This crime happened for a reason. The person who did it for a reason. They chose this house and chose these people for a reason. And even though in order to convict, you don't need that reason, I feel that in a crime of this nature and this magnitude, how public it is, that a lot of us would sleep better at night if we knew exactly why it happened. And I don't think hiding why it happened, if somebody knows, or if this entire process goes through and they do indeed convict and kill the perpetrator, but they never ever tell people why it happened, and there was nothing ever offered, there'll be people who never rest on this case. Let me know down below where you are. Did Brian do it? Didn't he do it? If he did it, why did he do it? And please, please, when you're telling me why he did it, please try not to give me excuses that were born from the likes of News Nation or Dateline, because that just ain't going to wash. There's got to be more to it, more substance. Why did he do it? Catch you all in the next one.